Soon after Chijiwa's death, Tsugumo's daughter and son also die. So without any more connections to the world, obviously he can no longer honor his promise to his dead friend, Tsugumo attempts to force the Ii clan to admit their needlessly excessive cruelty and rather superficial pride. And so he goes to the Ii clan under the pretext also of wanting to commit seppuku in their courtyard, and begins to relate the story of his life and Chijiwa Motome's life to the Ii clan. Of course, the Ii clan treat his story with disdain, and so he decides he will, after all, exact his revenge on the Ii clan. It is the climax of the film, and very awesome. So I suggest you watch it. So when I talk about samurai to my Western friends, the topic of Bushido almost always pops up. Bushido, or the way of the samurai, is a concept that many people associate with samurai and contains images of honor, loyalty, and devotion. Despite its really common use, however, people rarely actually sit down and try to quantify what Bushido actually is. Though it is translated as the way of the samurai, Bushido was never an explicitly stated code of conduct for the samurai, and its interpretations have varied tremendously over time. If you ask a samurai from the Sengoku period what Bushido is, he would obviously have no idea what you were talking about, because the word, as we know it today, only came to use during the 1600s. And a samurai from the 1600s would obviously disagree with a Japanese imperial soldier from 1944 about what sort of behavior Bushido refers to. My point is that it is always very important to be careful with how you throw around terms like Bushido, and that when you do use them, you are very clear about what you mean by it. Otherwise, the word becomes too vague to be of any real use to anyone. Today, I think that the concept of Bushido that's popular in the West is almost entirely derived from its use during World War II, and to a lesser extent from the works of Mishima Yukio from the 1960s and 70s. Thus, Bushido is closely associated with loyalty and honor, but these are depicted as irrationally rigid and uncompromising concepts. More importantly, Bushido's relationship with death and the willingness for a warrior to accept death at any moment are fundamental to its modern understanding. In other words, if you look at Mishima Yukio's version of Bushido, he has an almost fanatical obsession with death and a view of death that is highly sexualized. So, of course, viewing death as an act so important that it is virtually orgasmic is not something that a samurai from the 1600s would probably have thought of when he thought of Bushido. However, this obsession with a glorious death and an absolute uncompromising loyalty to a lord is probably not so similar to what samurai from the Edo period thought of when they heard the word Bushido, if they even heard it at all. Despite the fact that HARAKIRI, which is one of the most well-known books on the way of the samurai, was written during the 1600s, it was not actually very popular during that time, and represented the opinions of an extremely small minority within the samurai class. Even Nitobe Inazo's book, Bushido, The Way of the Samurai, must be read with a critical eye. Nitobe grew up in Hokkaido, which was quite far removed from mainstream Japanese culture at the time, and he was also a Quaker. He married an American woman and spent a large part of his life not in Japan, but in America. So while I'm not refuting that Nitobe was a very important bridge between Japanese and American culture when he was alive, I am saying that maybe his interpretation of Bushido is not 100% accurate to what mainstream Japan thought, or maybe he selected certain things that he thought were important to emphasize to a Western audience that maybe are not so important on a day-to-day level in Japan. So again, I'm just saying that these books that you read, they're classics for a reason. They're very, very good, but it's important to keep in mind when they were written and what purpose they were written with, and to not just uncritically accept what you read in Bushido, The Way of the Samurai. So personally, I think that if any term can be applied to samurai during the Edo period, I would say that Neo-Confucianism is a much better fit than Bushido. Neo-Confucianism represents ideas of loyalty, but not just to one's lord, but also to one's family. It also contains ideas of honor, but not rigidly inflexible ones, but a sense of honor that asks the samurai to constantly evaluate his actions and the actions of his lord. Also, the obsession with death, commonly associated with Bushido, is absent in Neo-Confucianism. Let's remember that for the most part in the Edo period, the samurai were not warriors, but bureaucrats. Of course, this was a transformation, but it's important to keep this in mind. So, what the samurai upheld as the pinnacle of honor and loyalty and virtue is probably very different in 1850 than in the 1600s. So while samurai might have continued to superficially express their willingness to die at any moment, I'm sure that very few actually were. For example, Tsunetomo, the author of HARAKIRI, he was a samurai, but he actually never experienced battle himself. He no doubt trained in the arts of warfare, but he had never actually experienced warfare himself. So you have to ask how willing someone is to die in battle if they have never actually experienced it. Most importantly, though, Neo-Confucianism reinforced the importance of compassion, a virtue that is almost universally overlooked in discussions of Bushido, but a virtue that is very important in Japanese culture. And of course, in the film Harakiri, compassion is a virtue that the Ii clan obviously lacks. They won't listen to Jijiwa's story about his family, and they make him commit seppuku with a bamboo blade. You don't get much more mean than that. So, broadly speaking, Tsugumo Hanjiro represents the more compassionate Neo-Confucian view of samurai honor. Despite his desire to commit seppuku after the death of his lord, he honors his friend's wishes and raises his son as his own. Though he is forced to live in poverty, he never once acts dishonorably or marries his daughter away for personal gain. Only at the end of the film, after he has fulfilled his obligations to his lord, friend, and family, does he seek out revenge and an honorable death. Conversely, the Ii clan represents a much more dogmatic, vain, and selfish version of Bushido. They are not concerned with actually honing their martial skills, which is demonstrated by the ease in which Tsugumo cuts off the top knots of the samurai responsible for Chijiwa's death. I have to point out that it's probably much more difficult to subdue someone and cut off their hair than it is to actually kill them. So clearly, the Ii clan, despite the fact that they were obsessed with martial valor, were actually not very good warriors. And so they were only interested in preserving the image of martial valor. So of course that's superficial, it's a facade. And Kobayashi represents this empty vanity with the armor of the Ii clan. At the end of the film, Tsugumo knocks it over and destroys it. But then the Ii clan, after Tsugumo dies and commits seppuku, they prop it back up, which is obviously a visual symbol for the empty, superficial form of Bushido that the Ii clan has. So obviously this review has run very long, much longer than I ever initially wanted it to. So if you'd like to read a more thorough explanation of my interpretation of the forms of Bushido found in Harakiri, then please read the essay on my blog. But I again would like to point out that I'm talking very specifically about the Edo period, and that if I were maybe writing a paper about Japan during World War II and the Imperial Army, I would definitely write something very, very different about Bushido. So again, before you freak out at what I've said and try to argue with me, I just say that you should understand that this is a complex, multifaceted subject that A, cannot be completely covered in a few minutes on YouTube, and also B, has many, many different interpretations. So please forgive me for some of the generalizations I've included in this review. And I'd be happy to clarify any questions that you might have, or if you want to point out a different interpretation than what I've suggested, please do so. So with that in mind, thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time. Peace.